Thank you, Chairman Krishnamurthy and Ranking Member Cloud. And thank you to all of you all for being here today. Mr. Salter, I grieve with you. I understand the tight bonds there are between a mother and a son. And I also held my mother-in-law when she lost her 34-year-old son. And I grieve with you. It's very sad. Like many of my colleagues here today, I'm troubled by the findings and the experiences that we have heard. For years, consumers have utilized products that contain talc without so much as a second thought. We have used it ourselves.
Legislation to pass for people to stop dying. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tlaib. Ms. Miller, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Krishnamurthy and Ranking Member Cloud. And thank you to all of you all for being here today. Mr. Salter, I grieve with you. I understand the tight bonds there are between a mother and a son. And I also held my mother-in-law when she lost her 34-year-old son. And I grieve with you. It's very sad. Like many of my colleagues here today, I'm troubled by the findings and the experiences that we have heard. For years, consumers have utilized products that contain talc without so much as a second thought. We have used it ourselves. I've bought products from both Claire's and used baby powder for years and years and used it on my children as well. It is even more concerning that people have known about these carcinogens in the products and have put them on store shelves regardless. Mr. Faber, I agree that we need oversight to ensure that products put on store shelves are safe. However, we must also ensure that regulations placed on these companies are not so stringent that they may halt production altogether. It's such a fine line to walk. How would you suggest that we ensure more testing is done without stifling the research and the innovation that it takes?
Thank you for the question. We've worked very closely with companies like J&J, Procter & Gamble, Revlon, Estee Lauder, and L'Oreal, as well as many small companies who are just the real innovators in this industry to craft legislation that would give FDA the power to review and, if necessary, regulate contaminants linked to cancer, birth defects, or reproductive harm, but would recognize the differences between very large companies like Procter & Gamble and very small companies that are going to provide the most innovative products in our economy. So I think the evidence that FDA can provide this oversight is all of the success we already see in the drug sector, the medical device sector, among food companies. I don't think it's hard to imagine striking a balance where FDA can ensure that these everyday products don't contain ingredients linked to cancer or reproductive harm, and that we continue to have many of these everyday products in our home. There are certainly going to be cases where chemicals or contaminants are so dangerous that they shouldn't be allowed in these everyday products, but there are literally thousands and thousands of ingredients available to formulators, and companies make products every day that don't include many of the chemicals and contaminants that I've mentioned in my testimony.
Is there a way to ensure that companies institute stringent testing procedures rather than relying upon the FDA?
We've relied on self-regulation now for more than 60 years. When Congress first began to consider whether or not to give these powers to FDA in the 1950s, and when Congress gave FDA the power to regulate chemicals in food and chemicals in 1958 and chemicals in colors in 1960, we instead chose to rely on industry self-regulation with regards to cosmetics. I think today's testimony and the support of so many cosmetic companies for more regulation is evidence that relying on self-regulation no longer makes sense.
What steps can Congress take to help empower companies and the FDA to utilize safe products?
The first step is giving FDA the power to identify those ingredients that have been linked to cancer or birth defects and reproductive harms, and making an assessment of whether or not, first and foremost, those ingredients and contaminants should be in these products at all, or whether they should be restricted to certain levels, as many other countries, more than 40 other countries have done. For the most part, most countries, when they look at these questions of the safety of these ingredients, have decided to restrict them to levels at which they would not pose any harm. Now, that's certainly not the case for a contaminant like asbestos. There's simply no safe level of asbestos. If we cannot sell products that are free from asbestos, they shouldn't be sold at all. But for most of the ingredients that have been regulated around the globe, countries like Canada, countries in Europe, countries in Southeast Asia, Korea, Japan, Australia, have generally taken the step of restricting chemicals to certain amounts so that we're not exposed to so much of that chemical that we would be at an increased risk of cancer or other serious harms.
Thank you. I yield back the rest of my time.